the politics of joy and justice. It was 21 years ago when the Madison Square Garden filled with the famous No Nukes rally, where another generation of artists came together with a massive protest against nuclear power. And after that rally in October 1979, there never was another nuclear plant ordered in the United States of America. Everywhere, all over the country where we've campaigned, from Hawaii to Maine, from Alaska to Florida, every state, many states more than once, all over the country we confront one attitude. No matter what people call themselves, liberals, progressives, moderates, conservatives, whatever, the attitude is that they've lost control. They've lost control over their government. They've lost control over their workplace. They've lost control over the protection of childhood for their children. They've lost control over their environment. They've lost control over their right to choose a doctor in a hospital. They lost control. They've lost control over their own personal privacies. They've lost control even over their own human genes to these giant corporations. They've lost control over what's in their food. They've lost control over what's in their drinking water and what's in their air. They've lost control over what they already own, the public airwaves over which radio and TV transmits their station. They've lost control over the great public lands, 1/3 of America, that have been ceded to the giant mineral and timber corporations with their grip on Washington. They've lost control even over trillions of dollars of labor pension monies that belong to the workers in this country. They own these trillions of dollars, but the banks and insurance companies control them. And it's time for the American people to take control of the Commonwealth that they already own. Imagine if workers in this country controlled the $5 trillion in pension monies which are now invested in these giant corporations. If they controlled this money, not only would they invest this money in outlets that reflected worker interests rather than corporate and speculator interests, but if they invested it in those giant corporations, they'd control those giant corporations who would have to behave or else. Imagine if the radio and TV stations began to pay rent for a change. So the billions of dollars that they've owed us over 70 years for using our public airways free will go to fund the creativity of the American people through these radio, TV, cable, and other creative and cultural outlets, so that we don't always turn into a nation of spectators, which is what big business wants us to do. Of course, just sit and watch instead of create and be dynamic. And the great public lands that are being pillaged and plundered by a whole set of large corporations who find the United States of America to be the only nation in the world that gives away its minerals, that gives away its timber for bargain basement prices, that literally gives away its gold, molybdenum, silver, copper, all these hard rock minerals. Third world countries strike a harder bargain with these multinational corporations than we do. Here's what Senator John McCain said earlier this year when he was running in the Republican primary. Quote, "American cynicism about government is born of many factors, but none greater than our defense of a campaign finance system that is little more than an elaborate influence peddling scheme in which both parties conspire to stay in office by selling our country to the highest bidders, end quote. We're going to put a stop to this once and for all with our effort. What about poverty in the land of the free, home of the brave? Booming economy on the one hand, booming corporate profits, booming executive compensations for the bosses, the heads of whom in the top 500 companies go to work every day and make $50,000 a day, not counting benefits and perks, while their workers are lucky to make $100 a day. What about poverty? 20% child poverty in the USA, richest country in the world. There are countries in Western Europe that have abolished poverty. They did it in the 1960s and the 1970s. In the disenfranchised colony known as the District of Columbia, child poverty is at 34%, and it's been run by Democrats in the Congress and Democrats in the district. Now, what is going on here? Why does California have 25.2% child poverty, which is comparable to 1980 when it was 15%? Because the inequities of power lead to huge inequities of wealth, which lead to huge inequities of income, which lead to cruelty to the children in our country and their parents who can't get a decent paying job. We're the only country in the Western world where there isn't a national mission to abolish poverty. We know how to abolish poverty. There are all kinds of ways, and we can learn from Western European countries. Why are these big corporations keeping America down, keeping America last? We don't have adequate paid maternity leave. We don't have adequate paid sick leave. We don't have adequate private pensions. We don't have adequate public transit systems for people who can't get around and get to work if they don't have a car. And yet the economy keeps growing. But there's a disconnect, there's an apartheid economy here. The majority of workers in this country, white, black, and brown, are making less in real dollars, inflation adjusted, than they were 20 years ago and 25 years ago, and they're working 163 hours on the average more a year. We're going backwards while the rich are becoming super rich, driving to become hyper rich with their big corporations. I say it's time to ask why, coming out of war-torn World War II Europe, Western European governments gave all their people universal health care coverage, along with Canada, and we didn't, and that's because the big healthcare industry has too much influence in Washington and said no. And we're the only country in the Western world that doesn't have it. They said no. No to the environmental movement who wanted to reduce the level of environmental violence that we too charitably call pollution, the toxics and the particulates and the devastation of our human biosphere. They said no. They said no to simple auto safety devices that are now in your cars and saving thousands of lives and tens of thousands of injuries every year. They said no. They said no to disabled people who wanted equal physical access and occupational access to fulfill their dreams. They said no, you're in the way, you're in the way. They kept saying no, and the American people periodically rose up and said, yes, it's going to be yes, whether you like it or not, we're going to have the power.